Tonight's program kicks off the Bayfield Heritage Association's 2021 John Matthew Black program series. This program series is our free educational lecture series on various local history topics. It's sponsored by the Apostle Islands Preservation Conservancy and our generous supporters like you all out there. My name is Megan Boyle. I'm the Executive Director at the Bayfield Heritage Association. We are a small museum in Bayfield, Wisconsin on the shores of Lake Superior, and we are dedicated to sharing the stories of our past and connecting our community members. Dennis is a Wisconsin native and a journalism graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He spent his newspaper career as a reporter and columnist, including 25 years at the Milwaukee Journal and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. His travels in search of stories and columns often brought him to this area. In 1999, he and his wife Barb, a retired teacher, bought property on the Brownstone Trail in Bayfield and built their current home. He now writes for several Gulf publications, and since leaving the newspaper business has published 4 books for Wisconsin Historical Society Press, including This Superior Place, Stories of Bayfield and the Apostle Islands. So you are in for a treat, and I will turn it over to Dennis. Enjoy.
Thank you, Megan. I really appreciate that. I want to thank BHA for having me, asking me to be part of this program. I'm flattered to be asked and honored to do the program. And I want to thank everybody in the audience who has turned out tonight. This is, I don't know in these cosmic times if you can call it the turnout if none of you even left your homes, but it really is nice to see the interest in this program. Probably helped that I told a lot of people that Amanda Gorman was going to be doing a warm-up poem, but that's all right. Just a word of explanation as we begin this. Typically for these kinds of programs, BHA asks people who were personally involved in the subject matter that they're talking about. When Bob Dahl talked about life on Sand Island, he did it as someone who had lived that experience. And when Bob Nelson talks about fishing on Rocky Island in the 1890s, it's possible that he was there. So just to be clear, I was not in Bayfield in 1945 nor anywhere else for 5 years after that. And I always point out at these talks that I am not a historian either. I'm a writer, but I've written a lot about history, both for the newspaper and since leaving the newspaper for the Historical Society Press. I want to thank Betty Cowley for her help. Betty is an author of a book that is the authority on the story of prisoner of war camps in Wisconsin. It's called Stalag, Wisconsin. It came out about 20 years ago, and I've had a copy all those years, so it was easy for me to start my research. And it's really the go-to source for all of this information about not only the big picture, but every little community that had prisoners working there. I talked to her recently, and she also very graciously agreed that we could use the photographs from her book. So we'll see some of those later on. What I've been asked to talk about, as you know, is the presence of German prisoners of war in Bayfield in 1945. But in order to do that, we've got to kind of step back, big picture style, and talk about how this all came to be. And it started earlier than 1945. As the United States was getting into World War II in 1941 and 1942, we were just getting involved. But England had been involved in the war for several years already. And they had amassed quite a number of prisoners of war, German prisoners mostly. As Betty Cowley put it, England was bursting at the seams with prisoners. And it wasn't long before there were concerns that they would become targets for German aircraft who would try to bomb the places that those prisoners were kept in an effort to free them, in which case they would be able to join the war effort again, and they would already be behind enemy lines. So that was a concern. And as the U.S. involvement picked up steam in 1942, the United States reluctantly agreed that it would take custody of all the prisoners that were captured by Great Britain after November of that year. And I say reluctantly, you can understand why, because it was a huge undertaking to bring all these prisoners back, even as we're gearing up at the same time for wars on 2 fronts in 2 very different parts of the world. So we're sending transport ships to Europe, loaded to the gunnels with soldiers and material, and then loading them up with prisoners to bring them back to the United States. The plan was to house these prisoners at existing military bases, which already had buildings and facilities to do that. But we're talking, hundreds of thousands of prisoners. So it was still a massive undertaking on top of what was already massive undertakings. It was only later that the decision was made to use some of the prisoners to fill gaps in the American workforce, which was permitted under the Geneva Convention and the other rules of war. Because the need was real and the need was growing. As the domestic labor force continued to shrink as the war went on, and more men mostly were inducted in the military and sent overseas or put to work in factories producing goods for the war, the shortage became acute. We all know the story of Rosie the Riveter and the contributions of women at that time. But even that didn't fill all the labor holes that were created by the war. But it became apparent that there were these workers available in the prisoners if they could be put to work safely. How big a force was it? It was immense. As the war stretched on, the number of prisoners grew exponentially. More than 5,000 Japanese, 371,000 Germans, 51,000 Italians, and assorted other Koreans and other nationalities. By 1944, the United States found itself caring for more German and Italian prisoners of war at military bases than there had been American soldiers before the run-up to the war. And so ultimately, there were prisoners housed at 156 base camps throughout the United States. There were only 4 states that didn't have base camps. In Wisconsin, the base camp was established at Camp McCoy, which is in the western part of the state. It's a little bit east of La Crosse. You can see what is now Fort McCoy as you drive on the interstate. It was a former CCC camp in a lightly populated area, so it was a good place to put a lot of prisoners, thousands of them as a matter of fact. It was one of the first base camps that was established in the United States, and it quickly came to house thousands, which it continued to do until 1946. In fact, Camp McCoy had the largest population of Japanese prisoners of any camp in the country. And it's unique in American history as having housed both relocated Japanese Americans from the West Coast, who were civilians, citizens, and European and Japanese prisoners of war during World War II. So the country badly needed workers, and here were the workers, many of them actually willing and able. They were out of harm's way. They were not getting shot at. Many were getting decent food and care. And it's probable that many were of the opinion that getting out and working might not be the worst thing in the world. So there were obvious concerns on the government's part. If they attempted to send prisoners of war, who not long before had been fighting against Americans, into American communities, what would be the reaction of those communities? Would local residents be angry? Would they be vengeful, afraid? In some areas where the branch camps, as they came to be called, were proposed, the reaction was so negative that the camps were moved elsewhere. But in other places, the reception was largely favorable, and the branch camps were established with little uproar, and in some cases with genuine appreciation, because the labor of these prisoners helped to salvage crops that otherwise might have been wasted. Wisconsin's labor needs were largely agricultural, and so great was the need here that Wisconsin eventually housed more than 3 times as many prisoners in branch camps as even neighboring Minnesota. And Michigan had a lot of camps as well because of all the orchards over there. Hands-on labor by prisoners took place at canning factories, nurseries, dairies, and in fields and orchards like those we know today. There were initial benefits to this program that might not jump out at first glance. Rules governing prison labor required that they be paid by the farmers or the canneries that employed them, but the money went to the federal government. Cowley reported that between 1943, when the first prisoners were put to work in the United States, and in June of 1946, when the last POWs left for Europe, the labor of prisoners of war nationwide earned over $360 million for the Treasury, including several $million from Wisconsin. A little bit more about Camp McCoy. The first enemy prisoners that arrived in early 1942 included 106 Germans, 5 Italians, and 191 Japanese. And thousands more of all of those nationalities and more were to follow. Originally, the camp had 30 to 35 buildings that they could use for barracks and showers and mess halls and kitchens in a 20-acre enclosure. And as befitting a prison camp from which no one but the prisoners wanted to escape, a double line of 8-foot wire surrounded the facility, topped with barbed wire, and the bottoms of the fences were buried 5 feet in the ground to prevent tunneling. There was also a kennel of trained guard dogs in addition to the guard stations, and that became an integral component of the guard force through the war. By one account, it was a popular entertainment at the camp to put on displays of the fierce dog skills, just in case any escape-minded prisoners had thoughts of getting by the dogs. Initially, there wasn't too much movement from the camp, although some prisoners were taken out for work on nearby farms. But the Germans were put to work in the facility, creating more buildings and roads and doing other expansion chores as more and more prisoners kept showing up. Camp McCoy had one problem that a lot of other camps didn't face because it had this mix of German and Japanese prisoners who might have been common enemies from our point of view, but who didn't get along at all with each other. Each group had a strong belief in their own racial superiority and openly ridiculed the other group when they even bothered to look at them. One commander said the two groups just simply hated each other. On top of that, the Korean prisoners hated the Japanese for having conscripted them into the war and having attacked their country. And on top of that, Japanese Navy prisoners argued with Japanese Army prisoners over which group was militarily better. And given the fact that both groups were in a prison of war camp in Wisconsin, you'd think that would be a draw, but they fought about that. And the Germans who sympathized with the Nazis feuded with Germans who were not friendly to the Nazi cause, which was the larger component of group. So it was not exactly a melting pot there. But at the end of the day, there were bean pickers and apple pickers galore and at Fort McCoy, and a lot of beans and apples needed picking in Wisconsin. So it wasn't this peaceful little United Nations there, but potential for supplying critically needed labor couldn't be ignored, especially as the worker shortage grew as the war dragged on. The Geneva Convention and Red Cross rules on prisoner care allowed for them to be put to work, and many wanted to be put to work. The rules made it clear that the work could not endanger the prisoners' lives or safety, the work could not be demeaning, and the prisoners were required to be paid. There was also a requirement that prison labor would not replace the work of available American citizens, but only fill the gaps where there were no Americans to do the jobs. Well, there were plenty of those jobs that needed doing. Most of the prisoners who received wages as opposed to piecework got 80 cents a day plus 10 cents more for personal needs. So the prisoners were making about $19 a month. Well, new recruits in the military were getting paid about 21. So they were getting almost comparable wages. But the money, again, was going to the federal government. The personal funds were given in scrip so that the prisoners could use them in canteens at the camp. They couldn't be allowed to have a lot of cash because cash could be used to arrange escapes. So they had to use the scrip. But they were allowed to have individual savings accounts, and in some cases, save up money that they would take home after the war, plus or minus $100 in a number of cases. At Fort McCoy, most of the Japanese prisoners were not interested in working for the Americans. They had viewed that as aiding and abetting the enemy, and culturally, that was just not something that they were able to embrace. Most of the Germans were both willing and able. They'd already shown the willingness in the work that they performed at the fort, building roads and structures to handle the base population. And so as the officials began drawing up a network of branch camps around the state, and not right away, but eventually Bayfield would get one of those. In all, there were 38 branch camps established around the state, every place from Bayfield to Beloit, although Bayfield was about the only place in the far north that got them. They were much more in the south in agricultural regions. As I said, all the work was related to agriculture in its various forms. The first camps were established in a few communities in Wisconsin in 1944. Some were fairly large. Milwaukee was the largest with 3,000 prisoners at Billy Mitchell Field. And there were 2,000 at the peak in Door County, where they had all the orchards that needed work. They didn't always house them in tent cities as such. There were 450 Germans based at the former insane asylum complex in Sheboygan, and the Swartz Ballroom in Hartford came to house 600 prisoners. The peak in Bayfield was just 125 prisoners, which made it the smallest of all of the base camps in Wisconsin. But these camps were not always really visible in the communities in which they were located. I grew up in Janesville, and the canning factory was at the edge of town, and that's where they established the Camp Janesville, as it was called. And that was often the case. There was also a lot of censoring of news during the war. So in some of these cases, people wouldn't even be aware of what was going on in these prison camps. Others were much more obvious. In some of the smaller communities like Elkhorn and Lake Geneva, the guards actually would take prisoners to the local cafe for their noon meal instead of having meals brought to their workplaces. Prisoners sometimes worked alongside civilians wearing clothing that was prominently labeled PW, just in case anybody missed the fact. But there were often interactions that would probably look today like they were fraternization, which was supposed to have been strictly prohibited. Women at that time had entered the workplace, so there was some of the inevitable side glances and flirting that you would expect. and some more intimate activity, we might say, was later found to have taken place in some of these camps, which suggests that the guards were not exactly doing 24-hour prom duty as chaperones. Bayfield only had prisoners in 1945, and the reason they were here was because there was such a huge need for labor, first at the Bayfield Canning Company, which had opened in 1920. And initially the company had canned strawberries and raspberries and cherries and other products, but eventually it came to focus on green and wax beans. And Bayfield beans were said to have earned an enviable reputation. They were distributed under 3 labels: Bayfield, Knight, and Apostle Islands brands. The beans were planted in the spring and left to grow through the summer, and didn't need a lot of help during that period. But in the fall, when it was time to get the beans out of the field, into the factory, packed into cans and loaded onto train cars, they needed a lot of help. And in 1944 and 1945, after several years of war, there simply wasn't the help around. People who own tourist-related businesses might relate to that today. But of course, we were also known far and wide for apples, another crop that demands hands-on harvesting and processing. In 1945, the Bayfield County Press reported that Bayfield was the #1 fruit market and that buyers were begging for apples. It said, with a short crop in most of the nation and the Bayfield orchard loaded with possibly the greatest crop of all time, Bayfield has become the mecca for apple buyers. There are short ones, tall ones, fat ones, skinny ones. Some carry huge wads of cash. Others wield fountain pens. Some are bold, others try to be polite. Some are quick to make a deal, others make a show of caution. It's all the same in the end. Bayfield has nobody knows how many bushels of apples, good apples and little runts that go into the cider mills. And the world outside of Bayfield is crying for apples. Trucks and vans, the biggest on the highways, freight cars are all rolling out of Bayfield, and thousands of dollars are rolling in as the growers make a real killing in apples. And they were able to do that in part because the labor of German prisoners had finally come along. The enemy, you might say, had become our allies. And it was overdue. In 1944, there had been an urgent appeal for help here for the bean crop. There were just too many beans and not enough people to help process them. The headline in the county press said, "Farm labor situation critical in the county." And the county agent said that the shortage of help was critical all through the county. Men were gone to the military, were gone off to Europe and the South Pacific, and others were gone off to cities to work in big factories, making things for the war. In other years, people would come out of the woods workers, and help with the beans. But the war had also increased the demand for lumber and pulpwood, so that workforce was no longer available. And the government, by the way, had a vested interest in the successful harvest because a large share of the output was preserved for use by the Army, the Navy, and Allies. The rest would be for home consumption, which the newspaper said was to give an obligation to men, women, and children to do their share just as the soldiers were doing their duty. They said, when they are giving so much, surely we can spare a little of our time to carry the load of food production at home. And on the same front page that carried that story, urging people to pitch in, was another story noting that another 28 young men had just been drafted and were going to be leaving the region very soon, just as the harvest was approaching. So the need for labor was real, and it was growing ever greater as the war dragged on. Even so, Bayfield did not get prisoners in 1944, even as the government urged an increase in acreage of beans because of the labor shortage. The cannery wanted to operate at full capacity because it said beans are an important munition of war, and the army and civilians both need the food. But in 1945, help would come. By 1945, of course, the U.S. involvement in the war had been going on for nearly 4 years. And in fact, the war with Germany actually ended in May of that year. But it would take time to wind down the war in Europe and bring people back. So that didn't help with the drastic shortage of help that had local officials again appealing to the government to bring prisoners to this area to help. D.S. Knight of the Canning Company kind of led the charge on this, contacting the officials and handling the paperwork. And he let it be known that by August 8th, we should know whether there were prisoners coming to Bayfield for the harvest that fall. Army officials were said to be coming to the area to assess the need, and this time they decided that yes, Bayfield would get help. Prisoners were expected by August 25th, Knight announced, an army of 125 workers who would help harvest food crops. Oddly enough, that announcement was just a small item on the front page of the county press, which gave bigger play to a story that announced Junior League completes plan for carnival, food games, floor show, auction, and dancing. But there was a lot of talk in the community about the prisoners anyway. As the details emerged, the county press reported that supply trains were coming with a vast amount of supplies and equipment, tents, stoves, cots, bedding, etc. It is expected that the yard of the community building will become a tent city for the time that the workers are here, with special lighting and guard facilities. And of course, the facility they were talking about is what we call the old courthouse now, where the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore headquarters is located. I mentioned earlier the limited press coverage of a lot of these communities and even the censoring of stories about prisoners. That didn't appear to be the case in Bayfield, and there was really no sense in trying to keep it secret when most of the activity was taking place in plain sight. In August, the county press told of an open house at the prison camp where the Army entertained news reporters from Bayfield and Ashland and Washburn and Superior and Duluth even. And it turned out that reporters were informed there would in fact be no tent city because it had been determined that it was entirely possible and satisfactory to house the entire group, consisting of some 35 American personnel and 75 members of Rommel's African Army within the four walls of the old courthouse. So the guards were to sleep on cots on the first floor and the prisoners in bunk beds on the second floor. Bathing facilities were in the basement, and there were a few tents put up on the grounds for excess prisoners and guards. And the reporters were assured, so that they could also assure their readers, that the prisoners had already saved the federal government millions of dollars with their labor and would be used to harvest crops reaching 50 tons, depending on the weather. And it was noted that a number of these prisoners had been in the country for several years and had performed work elsewhere before coming here. The official said living conditions, food, etc., are good. Although prisoners are not given food that is scarce in civilian markets, American personnel are fed the first food in the market, and for both groups, careful watch is kept on caloric values. There was a lot of concern about people about what kind of food the prisoners were getting. It came up time and time again that people feared that they were living well and eating better than the people here were eating. It's almost amusing to read some of these, but you can understand that because there were serious food deficiencies that had developed during the war because of the voracious appetite of the American Army. But officials kept stressing that the prisoners would not be getting fat off diets that were better than those available to American citizens. So the first 75 prisoners arrived on August 26th with another 50 to follow. They put up a few guard stations on the grounds of the courthouse. There was no strong fence that you would associate with a prison or any kind of a security facility. There was a snow fence around the back, but it was more of a perimeter for the prisoners. And even more than that, it was to keep the curious citizens away, because the citizens of Bayfield were curious about what was going on here. Of course, these were enemy soldiers being housed in one of the most prominent buildings in town and one of the most prominent blocks in the city. And it was not unusual to have an audience of residents watching the prisoners get loaded onto trucks in the morning and come back in the evening after working. Their day began about 7:30 and could last up to 12 hours or until they had met their quota. There was more piecework done in some of these operations here than elsewhere. Cowley wrote that the prisoners seemed in good physical condition, but looked forward to moving from picking beans to picking apples because it meant they could reach up instead of reach down and bend over all the time. Growers were generally pleased at the work the prisoners performed, and there was a lot of it. Between September 1st and September 29th, the total earnings of PWs, as they were called in Bayfield area, was $6,695. Well, they put in more than 10,000 man-hours of work for the Bayfield Canning Company and more than 1,200 more hours for the Bayfield Fruit Co-op. This all took place 75 years ago, of course, but I was able to talk to a few people who remembered that excitement. Yvonne Moody, who many of you know, was 7 or 8 years old at the time this took place, and she said, "I remember as a kid walking by, and they would wave at us kids, and it was very exciting." She doesn't remember any particular warnings about her safety or any real community concern about that, though she thinks she might have been told to keep her distance from the prisoners. But still, she said, "I was just this little bitty blonde kid who walked across the iron bridge and waved at them." Lois Van Nevel was another Bayfield native who remembered that summer. Her father, Sig Anderson, operated the canning company, and she was affected, even though she was only 8 years old. She told me she was affected by this, but not in a particular serious way. Her usual walking path to school was across the grounds of the courthouse. And because of the prisoners and the fencing, she had to take a slightly longer route. She said anyone in the area was affected when they walked to school. But again, she said that there were no particular safety concerns. I don't remember anyone being concerned. Most of them were pretty much kept there. I can remember staring at the guys when they were out. Most of them, I think they were very young. They would be about 18 or 19. The soldiers would be very young, just like the US Army. She also thought that a lot of people in Bayfield might have had a more limited understanding of what was happening in the war than might be true in other places, given the more limited news coverage that was available and being apart from population centers. But she does remember being happy when the prisoners left because it meant that she could resume her old walk to school. I also talked to Jim Hauser, who was another resident who remembers those days because his family farm depended on prison labor that summer. As might be expected, he said that he and the kids his age were more impressed with the guards because they came with rifles than the prisoners. Hauser's grandfather Dawson spoke German, and so he was able to communicate easily with the prisoners, which made it easier to explain what chores needed doing and how they should be done. Jim Hauser said, they seemed like pretty good guys as far as I could see. They were all willing to work. It gave them something to do. When you get 8, 10 more guys, it helps out. It made a big difference in how much work got done. They were pretty much laid back people as far as I was concerned. The guards always left an impression too. It was pretty casual duty for them mostly. They would get the prisoners up to the job site and then they would find a place in the shade and sit down, or they would play cards. Escape seemed not something that anybody was worried about. Hauser said the guards were really relaxed and the prisoners didn't seem interested in much more than picking apples, which if you have an orchard is really a good thing to have. For her book, Betty Cowley also talked with some people from Bayfield about those times. Jack Erickson told her that the prisoners on his farm made special bean picking seats. They attached a plank to blocks of firewood and attached the seats to their posteriors with ropes so they could remain seated as they moved up and down the rows of beans. Harriet Haugen Johnson remembered watching the prisoners being loaded into trucks in the morning or unloaded at the end of the day. And like everybody else, she said there were no particular concerns about their presence in the community, no particular fears. However, she also remembers that many of the girls in high school were enamored of the guards outside the courthouse, which probably makes sense at that time when, after a few years, when there weren't many young men around town, these were young men. Lois Van Nevel said one local girl actually later married one of the guards. So I guess there's something about a man in uniform. So the guards spent a lot of their time relaxing and playing cards. Their nights going to be a little bit more exciting when they got into the bars downtown. Bayfield had just a one-man police force at the time, so one of the POW guard sergeants would patrol with him to try and keep the guards somewhat civil as they got into their cups. One night they found 2 boys, including Merton Benton's son Bruce, on a woodshed, flashing their flashlight at the camp. They didn't know Morse code, but they were pretending that they did. Again, there wasn't much concern about possible escapes. One grower remembered an occasion when one of the guards propped his rifle up against an apple tree while talking to his buddy. And one of the prisoners happened to see the camp commander's jeep approaching, and he ran and got the rifle and took it to the guard to give it to him so that he wouldn't get in trouble for neglecting his duty. That's not to say that everybody welcomed the prisoners. Mary Torbick McCarty told Cowley that while prisoners were engaged digging a ditch on the Torbick farm, her brother John returned home from the war, where he had been a medic in combat and had seen the ugliness of the war up close. He was very uncomfortable with the Germans around and really wanted nothing to do with them. Apparently there had been concerns expressed earlier because in May of 1945, which would be several months before these prisoners even arrived, the editor of the Bayfield County Press, Frank Dexter, wrote about the community's debate that was going on. He said, on the matter of getting Nazi prisoners into this region to work, persons of Bayfield expressed themselves as not very fond of Nazi prisoners of war, but couldn't see any reason why said prisoners would sit around on fat posterior protuberances and eat good American food and do no work and get paid for it. So it's again with the food people were worried about. He said, it figures they ought to be put to work to help produce food to feed the millions of folks who have been left homeless and destitute because of Nazi hellishness. We want the folks of Bayfield to understand that the intention is not to deprive local folks of jobs. It would be understandable that families that had been directly impacted by the fighting in Europe or who had lost friends or family members would have a hard time accepting the presence of German prisoners in their communities. But the reaction of many in Wisconsin, and it was true here as it was elsewhere, was much more nuanced. As Cowley put it, while the combat soldiers learned to hate and fear all the Japanese and Germans, the civilians on the home front saw only the smiling faces of the disarmed German soldiers, far removed from any combat zone. It's also important to remember that in the 1940s, about 1/3 of Wisconsin residents still claimed German ancestry, especially German cities like Milwaukee and Sheboygan, but really all across the state. So many people had relatives fighting on both sides of that war. One Sheboygan resident was astounded to answer a knock on his door one day, and he opened it up and found his brother wearing a prisoner of war uniform. And a prisoner in Hartford was regularly visited by his uncle, who was even allowed to take him home to see the rest of the family, although officials would not let that prisoner work in his uncle's meat shop. And conversely, one man in Antigo wanted nothing to do with his nephew, who was here as a prisoner. It's also true that among Wisconsin's population with German heritage were people who had immigrated specifically to avoid being drafted into the military in Germany. So in describing the reaction to German prisoners suddenly living and working next door, Cowley wrote, "They quickly recognized that most of the soldiers in Hitler's army were not philosophical Nazis, but just draftees caught up in the times. With such strong German ties, many citizens sympathized with the prisoners, but not with Germany's role in the war." Elsewhere in the state, some residents made their own accommodation with the situation, rules against fraternization notwithstanding. It was common for wives to bring the workers lemonade to have with their lunches, or even beer on occasion. In Dodgeville, one woman told Cowley she remembered that her mother let the prisoners keep their sacked lunches for an afternoon snack, and she would bring the prisoners into the house for a sit-down, home-cooked meal at the afternoon. Her reasoning was that she had two son-in-laws who were in the service, and this was essentially her way of paying it forward in hopes that if they or her own sons were ever prisoners of war in some far-off place, that someone would take care of them. And so the prisoners worked and Bayfield benefited, as everybody had hoped they would. Initially, they harvested beans, and some worked in the canning factory. The agreement was that the farmers would pay the prisoners 2 cents per pound for beans picked with a minimum guarantee to the Army of $4 a day. Now, that meant prisoners would have to pick about 200 pounds of beans per day, which was a heavy ask in the beginning. On the first day, an average of only about 150 pounds per prisoner was recorded, but the workers got better with experience. Maybe those seats they had tied to their butts helped a little bit too. Unfortunately for the growers, the harvest ended below expectations, not because of inexperienced pickers, but because of unfavorable weather earlier in the year. Later, the job shifted to the orchards for picking and also to the Bayfield fruit growers' new co-op sorting and packing plant, where prisoners worked 3 shifts around the clock at the height of the season. As I said earlier, it was a big year for apples, and Bayfield shipped rail cars and trucks filled with apples all across the country. And then came October, and the apple harvest was complete, and the community debated what would come next. A headline in the county press on October 18th read, "They will, no they won't, guessing contest continues." And the guessing contest concerned whether the Germans would stay in Bayfield to help with the herring harvest, which was another requires a lot of labor to pack and process. Fishing interests wanted the prisoners to be available. But one objection was the 25-day gap between the end of the apple picking season and the start of the herring run. And the fishermen would have had to cover the cost of keeping the men, both guards and the prisoners, in town for 3 more weeks, all downtime with no production. So a week later, the county press reported that the guessing contest was over. "Stop," it said, "the will-nots win." If you remember, the rules for prison labor were that the work was not to take away from able-bodied Americans. And by late October, fighting had been done for a number of months, and people who had gone off to the war and gone off to other cities to work in factories were starting to come home, meaning that the labor picture was picking up. Irving Hadlin said that more were returning every day, and he was quoted in the County Journal as, "He further raised the pertinent fact that money paid out in wages to outsiders is of little value locally and that every consideration must be given to residents in the area. So a few days later, the prisoners and the guards packed up and left Bayfield for Fort Sheridan in Illinois, and that short but fascinating chapter was over. It wasn't entirely over for the German prisoners, however. Many remained in the United States into 1946 before they were finally returned to Europe. And even then, many of them remained prisoners for 2 or 3 years. They were again put to work, this time helping to rebuild places that their armies had so thoroughly destroyed during the war. Not surprisingly, many of the prisoners who had become quite comfortable with American culture and food and working conditions expressed an interest in staying, but the Army denied every request for that. The policy was 100% repatriation. By June of 1946, the only prisoners of war still in the United States included about 160 German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners who were serving time in US penal institutions. In Europe, many prisoners found they were treated much more harshly than they had been in the United States. In France, for example, they were not treated well for obvious reasons. East German authorities considered the former prisoners contaminated by their exposure to American ways and treated them poorly. And even some West Germans discriminated against them because they had not been made to suffer in the war as much as the people at the home front had. So the going home was not always finding this new life and good times that they might have been dreaming about. By the 1950s, former prisoners were allowed to immigrate to the United States under some circumstances, including having a sponsor and a job offer. And some did. In some occasions, people were sponsored by the farmer they had worked for when they were here, and they came back to the United States to, again, work on those farms. Maybe 5,000 former prisoners were eventually brought to America, became American residents or citizens, many of whom chose to live quietly and anonymously rather than identifying as former prisoners. But connections were made, and some of them lasted. In the 1970s, a former prisoner named Joseph Rulick came to Bayfield with his family, hoping to renew acquaintances with Dawson Hauser. And another Bayfield resident later told the Torbicks about his experience while traveling in Germany. He stopped in a bank to exchange some money, and when the teller saw the name Bayfield on his papers, he struck up a friendly conversation, recalling his stay at Camp Bayfield. So in the end, after her 3 years of research into the POW experience, Betty Cowley declared this a win-win for all sides. The military found a useful and safe system to use the onslaught of captured soldiers, and the payment system established by officials collected more than enough to pay for the maintenance of prisoners, with millions left over for the government. And Cowley said she found not one incident where a civilian in Wisconsin was intentionally injured or even directly threatened by a prisoner of war captive or escapee. And the bottom line was that prisoner of war labor saved tens of thousands of tons of food that might otherwise have gone unharvested and gone to waste. So we do have a few photos. This is Betty's book, Stalag, Wisconsin. Betty was a high school teacher in Altoona, near Eau Claire, and she was bothered by the fact that the kids that she taught had no access to information about the prisoner of war camp that had been in Altoona. So she started to research that. She also knew, because her husband was big into Civil War history, and they went to reenactments. She knew about Camp Randall in Madison having served as a prisoner of war camp during the Civil War for Confederate soldiers. And so she was going to twin up the story of Camp McCoy and Camp Randall. And then she found out about the 38 branch camps, and she really had to expand her research. So it took a lot longer, but she came up with this exhaustive portrait of what the situation was like. And she told me that it was just her mission was to save the story, and she did a great job so that we can share it at events like this today. These photos are by Ruth Moon, who was a Bayfield native. You can see the PW on the pants of the guy on the left. I'm not sure where they were standing at the warehouse. There were never any indications that they were in custody. There was never handcuffs or anything like that. What usually happened was the guards would make a show of force when they got to a community. They'd show rifles prominently, and the level of security would go down as they stayed. As I said, there was supposed to be no fraternization, but as they were working in places next to people from the community, it was impossible to avoid that. And I don't think the guards really felt it was their job to prevent that in all cases. Even though it was against regulations, sometimes the employees would share milk or sugar with them, and they would take it back to their camp for a treat later. This is Willie Frick. Camp life was hardly a place of pure punishment, whether that was at Camp McCoy or in the base camps like the one in Bayfield. Prisoners were allowed to practice their own religion. There was even a shrine for Buddhist celebrations at Fort McCoy. There was a priest from La Crosse who was a chaplain for those who needed a Catholic priest. And he even found a relative from Austria among the prisoners. Holidays were observed with traditional foods, ethnic foods if they were available. And even gifts for prisoners were arranged through the Red Cross. And they could observe cultural holidays as well, including a birthday party for Hitler once a year. Books were provided in their native languages, and in their spare time, prisoners could practice arts and crafts. They could play cards or watch movies. Some of the movies had World War II themes, and of course, they didn't always appreciate the way that their armies were depicted in these. They also didn't always like what they saw in the newsreels that came along because it showed the destruction in Europe that just maybe hit a little too close to home for many of them. And they also had music. They had choruses, and a number of them had instruments available, like the one that Willie is playing here. There was a great benefit if you had someone, either a prisoner who spoke English or a farmer or a cannery, a person who spoke German, because that was the one means of communication with people who were doing unfamiliar work. And in Bayfield, we had both of those. Ed Erickson had a theory that many of the prisoners who were brought to Bayfield were of an upper class because so many of them spoke pretty good English. And that's why it was easier for them here. This is a guard who's helping to pick apples for the fruit growers. Again, photo courtesy of Ruth Moon. The role of the guards was to make the citizens of the community feel comfortable as it was to be really strong security forces for the prisoners. As I said, they usually made a big show of force when they arrived, but as time went on, they became much more lenient about what the prisoners were allowed to do. And as the prisoners earned the confidence of more officials, the rules would relax even more so that some of them were able to go off and work individually on farms without guards along to watch them. They really just were free to come and go. And in fact, most of the prisoners were quite compliant, or they wouldn't have been selected for these jobs in the first place. There were only a few escapes that were attempted, and often those were just prisoners who went off at night to go swimming or to take in the sights or visit the ladies or the pubs. In the end, Cowley said that the military's position proved correct. Prisoners would not be inclined to run if they received fair treatment, good food in a warm, dry bed, medicines, and most important, they were not being shot at. And there's the courthouse. The guard tower on the right is not the most impressive structure in the world, but they needed those. As I said, there was just the snow fence to keep people away. The fact that it wasn't even a minimum security facility is interesting. And, it was a small town, but this was before television came along. So people really just kind of showed up and they'd stand on one side of the fence and watch the prisoners or wave at them. The prisoners would play games on the lawn sometimes. They had a volleyball net. It wasn't necessarily a Hogan's Heroes kind of looseness, but it wasn't the harshest treatment in the world for the prisoners. And this is a Bayfield guard tower by two guards. I talked earlier about the fierce guard dogs that were at Camp McCoy. And if you look at in the tower here, they have a little dog, the mascot. More dust mop than fierce attack dog, but that was the Bayfield version of the guard dog. It's interesting that this story continues to resonate with people too. A couple of years ago, my friend Bill Stokes published a novel called Margaret's War, set in a small town in Wisconsin during World War II, and it involved prisoners coming and a romance that developed. And I just noticed the other day publication of a new book by a guy in Milwaukee, D.W. Hennigan. The book is called The Home Front. And the description is that Maggie is a battered farm wife who hires the labor of POWs from Camp Ramsey, which is made up, while her husband is off to war. And it said, playful Adam Klein complicates life for her in more ways than one. And I'm sure we can all guess what that would be. And that's the story of prisoners in Bayfield in 1945.
Well, thank you, Dennis. What a storyteller. I had a really fun time imagining these things that you were talking about. Super interesting to imagine that time frame and the complicated emotions and yet the overriding reality that we are all human and there's work to be done, and especially the focus on the food and the farms and how productive the orchards were back then.
Right, right. And in a lot of cases, when people in the community would look at these soldiers, they would see young men about the same age as their sons who had been sent off to war. So there was not the attitude that they were these terrible Nazi enemies. It humanized things, which is what always happens when you meet the enemy in person, I suppose.
And once again, a big thank you to Dennis. And thank you all for joining us.